Hello, I'm John Beattie, and welcome to Cask to Glass, the Whisky podcast, where I explore the heritage and flavour of Scotland's national drink and the world's favourite spirit. Now, in this episode, I talk to Val McDermid, the best-selling crime author who loves whisky, plays in a rock band, and since her childhood has been influenced by the work of our national poet, Robert Burns, exciseman and whisky aficionado.
We're never going home. Can we stay with you in Scotland for the rest of our lives? We're never going home. Never going home. All it took was one sip of the water of life.
Val McDermid.
It's a pleasure. Yeah.
It's great to talk to you. First of all, how do you take your whisky?
With a wee splash of water. As somebody said to me many years ago, it releases the volatile esters. She's some lassie, that Esther.
Because bizarrely, we've spoken to Max McFarlane, who was the keeper of the Quaich at Edrington's, and he's also a master blender, and he has ice, and I have ice, but you like it with water.
Just a wee splash, yeah. I couldn't be doing with ice, no. Ice is for cocktails.
And what is your favourite kind of whiskey?
Well, I like the Islay malts, but not the really heavy phenolic ones like Lagavulin and Lafroig. I like Bowmore, Bunnahabhain. That's the kind of thing that really floats my boat. But I'm not averse to a wee glass of Jura or even on occasion something Highland or Speyside, if that's all there is on offer.
Are you not on record as saying the Speyside whiskies are girly whiskies?
Well, there was a conversation I was having with Abbey Mukherjee, a fellow crime writer. And I said, we always think that they're the lady whiskies. But I mean, what I tend to say about whiskies like that, they're the morning whiskies.
A morning whiskey?
Kind of a wee glass before lunch.
How did you get into whiskey? My memory of me as a wee boy is me and my dad in Borneo, of all places, right? So born in Borneo. And my dad would have his wee whiskey. He'd be telling me what a great country Scotland is. And it was all part of that, was my dad and a wee glass of whiskey and his pipe band music on the gramophone in the jungle of Borneo. And that's my first memory of whiskey and the beauty of it and the smell of it. How did you get involved in whiskey?
My dad wasn't a big drinker. We'd have a glass of whiskey at New Year, but that was about it. But my first real introduction to proper whiskey came when I was a teenager. My best friend from school, I used to go around her house and play Monopoly with her and her sister and her brother. And her father was the deputy headmaster of Kirkcaldy High School, but was a great whiskey connoisseur. And he thought that we ought to be inculcated into the real joy of whiskey and understand its quality and its beauty. So I must have been about 16 or 17. He started giving us a wee glass of whiskey. And they were all single malts, because he was a great believer in experiencing the purity of the single malt, and that we should learn the difference between the different genres. And so that was my introduction, was Sandy McLaren pouring me a wee dram at the end of a game of Monopoly. And so by the time I went off to university, I had a vague understanding of the sophistication of the malt whiskey.
You see, I heard a great programme that you were on with Nicola Meehan on BBC Radio Scotland. Fantastic programme. I think it was a pre-record, and you talked about your time as a young girl in Fife. And you never mentioned. Did you mention whiskey? Maybe I'd switched the radio off. Were you talking about whiskey then? This idea of having whiskey when you're 16 or 17.
Yeah, that was my first real introduction to it back in those days. I mean. As I say, it was something that we didn't really have in the house. My dad would have a half bottle of Bells for New Year, We did keep it in the house for my gran's minister. My grandparents lived in East Dreams, and they often had wedding receptions at the Station Hotel in Kirkcaldy, which was just across the street from us. And Mr. Welsh, the minister, would come across to our house at tea time on a Saturday for the football results. And Mr. Welsh had to have his wee glass of whisky. He used to go around the village visiting his parishioners, getting a wee glass of whisky at every stop. So that was kind of the drill. So that was I suppose, my introduction to the notion of whisky as a social thing. But nobody else in the house drank it with him. He'd sit there with his wee glass of whisky and watch the football results, then go back to the wedding reception.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? Again, families, and I think back to our family. My father would make a big rigmarole about a bottle of wine and the special moment of having wine. But before we move on, I don't know if you know that Fife effectively seems to be the birthplace. Did you know this, of Scotch whisky? That John Corr, 15th century Scottish mendicant friar, he's significant partly because of his connection to the earliest written record of Scotch whisky. King James IV of Scotland, I think, ordered him to make whisky, and that Fife is the birthplace of modern Scotch whisky. Did you know that, or was this just a briefing note that I've been given that you don't know?
Was that at Lindores?
It could be Lindores, but it's historian Janet Foggy's called this the first mention of whisky in a Scottish source.
Right. That's entirely possible. I mean, mostly we didn't write things down in Scotland at that point. I published a novella last year called Queen Macbeth, which is about the real Macbeths. And at one point I had them two people communicating by passing notes to each other. And I was informed by my publisher, who's a proper historian, that there was no paper in Scotland in the 10th century, so there was maybe whisky as well.
I'm being told it was Lindores off camera. Somebody's saying it was Lindores.
Yeah, well, Lindores, they have a distillery at Lindores to this day, and there's a restored distillery and a very fine place it is to visit. And you can also make your own spirit, and they've got a wee lab where you can add things to the raw spirit and make your own strange concoctions. But it's nice that tradition persists in Fife.
Yeah. I'd love to know about you as a wee girl, because again, on that radio programme, what struck me was you're a musician. I mean, I play guitar badly, but you play guitar well, you're a singer, you're a musician, but you and I've got a wee grandson who loves his words, and you loved, didn't you? You loved spending time reading and going to the library and just getting books and staying there and reading. Yeah. Just tell me about that, because that's totally, my world was a wee boy chasing snakes and monkeys, and your world is this wonderful world of words and reading and literature.
There weren't many monkeys in Fife, I have to say, apart from the cheeky wee monkeys I used to hang out with. But my parents were very much, sort of Scottish working class, both very bright people who didn't have the chance to expand their brightness by staying on at school or go to college or anything like that. And they believed that they wanted me to have better life chances than they'd had. And they thought the way to that was education. And so my mum really encouraged me to read from a very early age. She used to wheel me across the council estate in the pram to the library when I was very wee and read me children's books in the library. And then when I was about 6 years old, we moved house to live opposite the Central Library in Kirkcaldy, which was very well provisioned. It had been endowed by the Nairn family, the linoleum barons. And it was the children's library there was, I say, lots and lots of books of different sorts. And I just read my way around the shelves. An only child, it was how you passed the time when the adults were being boring, was to sort of go and sit in a corner and read. And I suppose that love of words, that love of reading, opened the world up to me. It opened my imagination. It made me see there was all sorts of possibilities beyond the narrow confines of the life I grew up into. And, there's that saying, if you can't see it, you can't be it. I mean, I certainly had the option to be all sorts of things from what I was reading. And that love of words kind of carried itself into the love of music as well, because the music I listened to mostly when I was growing up, when I was a teenager, apart from Scottish traditional music, was singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell, like Leonard Cohen, like Bob Dylan, like James Taylor. Performers for whom the lyrics were as important as the music. And so for me, that was part of why I loved the music so much, was because the words made sense of the world to me, and it was a different world, obviously, to the one I was growing up in. But that whole thing, it was all about the doors that could open to me, the doors of my imagination that were opened by words.
When did you first discover, like you, I remember at school in Malaysia, going back to the rubber estate and singing this song, Shalushu. And I tried to explain to my parents, who are from Glasgow, there was this new band out called the Beatles, and they had a song called Shalushu, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. And they'd never heard of the Beatles. And then I came to this country, and I'll never forget driving in my dad's Ford Cortina in the back seat, hearing a Beatles song. And I got hooked on the words and the music. And then you move, don't you, from, and I want to know about you here, but you move from being a person who's listening or reading to a person who creates. And, you know, I know you write music, I write a bit of music. You're a writer, and I kind of talk a little bit on the radio. When did you twig that all these influences that you've had, which are brilliant books and lovely music, can be turned and you can actually create them? When did that happen?
Well, the thing with the words was I used to read a series of books called The Chalet School, which was a girls' boarding school in Switzerland. I mean, you couldn't have been further away from growing up in Kirkcaldy, all these nice middle-class lassies growing up there and going off to exotic places. And one of the characters grows up to become a writer. And in one book, she gets a letter from her publisher, and it's got a cheque in it. And you remember cheques?
I remember a cheque.
And I thought, you get paid for doing this. It's a job. I thought, I could do that. I can make stuff up. I can tell lies. And that was the point where I realised that I wanted to be a writer. I was probably about 9 or 10 when that penny dropped. And that was, you know, I went through my teens all saying to people, say to me, what are you going to be when you grow up? And I'd say, I'm going to be a writer. And everybody would just laugh, you know, because folk like us didn't be writers. But the making music thing was very much from my father's side of it. My dad was a really fine singer. He was the lead tenor of the Bowhill People's Birds Club concert party. And so, you know, there was always music in the house. He'd listened to traditional music. The Corries were his favourite band. He was a big fan of Bing Crosby and Perry Como. So I grew up with the idea that you didn't just listen to music, you made music as well. And when I was wee, when we would go out for a run in the car on Sunday, we didn't have a car radio or a cassette player, so we just sang. We sang in the car, so it was always kind of part of my life was singing and making music. And when I was 12, I asked for a guitar, and I got this pretty dreadful nylon stringed cheap guitar, and that's when I started playing. And it just went from there. I can't really play so well anymore because, like so many of us, as you get older, your hands get stiff and sore. 50 years of typing doesn't help. But now the only time I play guitar is when I'm with my band, the Fun Loving Crime Writers. We do a mad version of Hit Me Baby One More Time, a sort of heavy metal version of Hit Me Baby One More Time, and I play bass on that, which is really simple. It's basically a five note bass riff, and I can manage that. But I love just, you know, like having a guitar on stage again.
Can I ask you? I'll say something I've never said before, which is I remember when I was a wee boy leaving Malaysia. My dad had a brain hemorrhage, and he was sacked because he was underperforming, and we had to move back to Scotland. Moved to Scotland for the first time. I was 10 years old, and I went around my school, and I got all the autographs from the wee boys, who I still keep in touch with, and girls. And the headmaster said, "You're the roughest boy we've ever had in this school. One day you'll play rugby for Scotland." I remember thinking, if that's all I ever manage, I'll get emotional here, that I'll be a happy boy for life. And I made it. But the thing I want to ask you is, when you make it, and I haven't made it to any extent similar to you in terms of literature and your worldwide name, but when you make it, you get I got a bit of imposter syndrome. Did you ever get that? You think people are reading my books, or people are interviewing me, I'm only Val, or were you always comfortable? Yes, this is my canon. I'm proud of this.
I still get the imposter syndrome.
Good.
You know, I mean, I find myself, like drinks with the Queen going like, and me for a Kunselhuis. You know, I'm still waiting to be found out. I remember when I went to Oxford for my interview, the very first of my interviews, the tutor that was interviewing me said, "So, Miss McDermid, how long did you live in Shetland?" And I thought, Shetland? They've got the wrong person. There's some wee lassie in Shetland that should be here, not me. And the confusion had arisen because the primary school I went to was called Fair Isle Primary. And she'd read this and thought, oh, Fair Isle Primary must be on Fair Isle. So I had the moment, absolute, sort of stomach clenching panic of thinking, they've got the wrong person. And I think that to some extent still is the case. I do sort of almost pinch myself. My partner Joe and I sometimes we go to some do and we're thinking, this is us. Is this really our life? It's not how I imagined my life would be. Let's put it that way.
It's weird, isn't it? We were invited to the then First Minister's house, which you'll have been a few times, and I thought it was going to be all rugby players. And Jill and I went along, and there was a big Bentley turned up, and it was Sean Connery. And we're thinking, we're sitting beside Sean Connery. And Sean Connery was telling me about how lovely my wife was, and he was touching her leg. He was touching Jill's leg, going, this woman must be protected. But you end up in places you never think. But you've got these brilliant novels. You've got your main star, is it Karen drinks gin?
Uh-huh.
Why gin?
Well, I thought, there's a sort of like thing of, there's a sort of cliche of Scottish crime fiction and Scottish detectives always drinking whiskey or beer in copious quantities. And I thought, she's a modern woman, and that was the point where artisan gins were becoming all the thing. And I thought that would be more interesting, because I could do something interesting with artisanal gins, if you like, that isn't something that everybody else is doing about whiskey. The irony, of course, is that I don't like gin. I can't stand gin. I did that terrible thing that you do when you're a teenager. When I was about 17, 18, I got absolutely paralytic on gin. And I was so hungover. I was ill for about 3 days. And now even the smell of gin makes me feel faintly queasy. So I gave this taste for gin to Karen, and she meets up with one of her colleagues every now and again for Gin Mondays, and as a result, people sometimes give me a bottle of gin because they think she'll like that. It's just like no. So my partner Jo, I mean, she's a geography professor at St Andrews, and the geography department at St Andrews have been the grateful recipients of quite a few bottles of gin over the years.
Well, that's where the gin all goes.
Where the gin all goes. Yeah.
We're talking around about Burns time, and I know your father. Am I right? Your father was out a lot doing Burns dinners. Is that right?
Yeah. We hardly ever saw him really in the months of January and February, because the Bowhill Burns Club concert party would go out and do Burns suppers all over the place, old people's homes, hospitals, Masonic lodges. Basically, if you wanted a concert party for your Burns supper, they were one of the people you could turn to. So he'd be off singing at these suppers, and also the Bowhill Club, I think is unlike a lot of people who put on Burns suppers. They're really serious about their Burns, and when they meet at their monthly meetings, half of the evening is devoted to reciting and singing in the back room of the pub, and they have serious discussion about the poetry and about Burns's ideas and his background and his life. So it's really serious about it. They take it seriously, but they have a good time as well. I often say you can't imagine people getting together and having a Wordsworth night where they sit in the back room of a pub and drink whiskey and eat pies and get excited about William Wordsworth. It's a very sort of Scottish thing. So yeah, I think my dad took it seriously, and he was he brought me up really on the principles that Burns espoused, of internationalism and of egalitarianism. There was Burns in the late 18th century writing about the rights of women, for example, and so he brought me up. I think I would say that his watchword was really the words of "a man's a man for all that." He brought me up to believe I was as good as anybody else, that I should call no man my master, and that has been kind of what I grew up with as my own principles for living, I mean, as well as the imposter syndrome, which is still very real, I also have at the other side of my head the wee voice going, "You're here because you deserve to be." So there's that sort of that's very Scottish, isn't it? That sort of what Hugh McDermid called the Caledonian antisyzygy, the capability of holding two opposing ideas in your head at the same time. So that I guess that's part of what's made me the person I am.
What do you love about Burns? I'm not the wordsmith you are. One of the things my father gave me was the Sir Ernest Gower's plain English. So all my life I've tried to say the simplest thing in as few words as possible. But I've learned the toast to the haggis, and it is 8 verses of sheer perfection. I've looked at it as a non-wordsmith and thought, nobody in the world could improve on this. What is it you love about Burns?
I think it's partly his command of the language is remarkable, whether he's writing in Scots or English. And I do think his Scots verse is better than his English verse. I think his English verse can sometimes lean towards the trite in terms of his expression, but he's a way of encapsulating things that we recognise as truth in few words. And I mean, you read something like "A Fond Kiss." If you read the words as well as listen to the song, we've all been there. We all understand the power of love that's thwarted in one way or another, love that's lost in one way or another. While love is like a red, red rose, there's a simplicity to it, but also a command of the meter and the Burns stanza, as it's now called, that 6-line verse, which has its own rhythm and its own music. The cadence that he brings to the words, and the words fit. I mean, when you're trying to write song lyrics, particularly trying to get the meter right so that it's not clumsy and awkward, it's very, very seldom that you get wordsmiths who can do that so unfailingly, and Burns does it every time. The Beatles were very good at that as well. Getting the words that fit the meter and the rhythm, and that is, I think, is one of the reasons why Burns is so beloved. And if you listen to something like if Tam O'Shanter properly performed, it's an absolute gallop. It's a great story. It's exciting, and it just flows. And there are moments also where it pauses. Where the snow falls in the river, a moment gone, and then a moment white, then gone forever. His pacing is terrific as well. I mean, I think he's a real wordsmith. He knows what he's about. And that's extraordinary when you think that he had no schooling to speak of. He didn't have the chance to go to a course in creative writing. He didn't have the chance to spend a weekend learning how to be a versifier. He just read other people's work, and almost by instinct figured out what worked and what didn't work. Such is remarkable.
Yeah, and he was so young. And the thing that I don't know if you do the Burns suppers. I've done a few, but I've been to these, back in the day, pretty misogynistic toast to the lassies, and then there's a reply on behalf of the lassies, and then, as you say, somebody might do Tam O'Shanter, and I'm always, are you not gobsmacked that people can remember it?
Well, I don't know. I think if you love it, you learn it.
Yeah.
I've got the Bowhill Burns supper at the end of the month, and there'll be guys there reciting poems or singing songs that are not commonly done at Burns suppers. I mean, it's a very long Burns supper. You have to have stamina for that Burns supper. But it's extraordinary. Yeah, you've got these guys who are in they're quite old, some of them are 60s, 70s and beyond, with absolute word perfect recollection of these poems, because they speak to them. they're not highfalutin and out with their experience and their understanding of the world. They remember them because it matters to them. I don't know that there are that many poets you could say that of these days.
Do you worry we forget the language? I mean, even the Toast to the Haggis is full of words most Scots don't use. Do you worry that language is going?
I'm less worried about it than I used to be, I think, because there is a much more commitment to Scots, speaking in Scots and writing in Scots, than there was, say, even when I was growing up. You have writers like Irvine Welsh and Douglas Stewart using Scots vernacular in literature, but also it's much more commonly used in common speech. It's used in comics. It's used in the vernacular much more, and I think there's a lot more use of it than there was. And certainly, the language of the street, people use Scots vernacular quite strongly now, I think, and it's growing. There's a recognition also, sort of in academic circles, that Scots is not just a dialect, it's a language. And I always try to pepper my books with the odd Scots word or Scots expression, using it in context so that people who are not Scots can understand the meaning of the word. So I have introduced words like dreich and sleekit and druthy and things like that in my work, that people will then go, oh, that's a great word. Scunner, that's a marvellous word.
Yeah, wheesht. Because we're diverting from the topic, but there's a huge snobbery in language, isn't there? There's a huge snobbery in that there's a right way to say something. And just because somebody has a dialect, let's say you've got an Ayrshire dialect that's Seven, or they've got their own words. And I remember when I first became a rugby player, and, you're mixing with guys from Hawick and Kelso, and they have a different, they'll talk yin, twa, thry, four, 5, 6, 7. And they'll talk about your kite rather than your stomach. And there's a kind of there is a snobbishness, isn't there, which goes, no, that's not real language.
Yeah, and when I was a kid, I'd get told off for, my mother would tell me off for saying things like "iways." It's always, Iways. Because she thought I would be judged for not being able to speak properly. Whereas my gran had a rich seam of dialect in her everyday speech, which I absorbed, and that to me was special, because it was not the language of, if you like, of everyday polite discourse. It was an expressive way of speaking, and has stood me in good stead on trips to Scandinavia, because I could communicate some simple things to Swedes and Norwegians because I've got the words. I'll tak the yet him, and gan do the rope, gan out. When I listen to sort of Nordic noir television programs, I'm always convinced by the halfway through the show that I can speak Norwegian.
Ken.
I'm filled when people say "gan out." I know what they mean. And I think there are different. People like Billy Kay, who is devoted to the Scots language, and publishers Itchy Coo, which is they bring out books for children in Scots. So I've contributed to their renditions of Hans Christian Andersen and Grimm's fairy tales for Scottish children, and it's great to have that sort of take the brakes off and just be Scots. And so these kids are actually reading these stories in Scots and learning the words and learning how to express themselves in their own tongue. We're lucky because we have a range of different Englishes, if you like. We've got Scots, we've got Standard English, and so we can speak with a hale voice.
There'll be very few poets in the world anywhere who have spread so far. And there'll be burn suppers in Moscow, whether there are any more I don't know, Australia, New Zealand, China, and there are whiskey distilleries all over the world too. But why do you think Burns has become so global? What is it about this little country of ours with 5 million people? Back when he was writing, as you say, late 18th century, when there was, I think the year he died, there was famine. What is it about that man's writing, do you think, that took it around the world?
I think because it's human. It deals with, the things that he writes about are universal. He writes about love, he writes about poverty, he writes about death, He writes about hypocrisy. He writes about desire. He writes about aspiration. And he also writes about injustice. He gets angry about things. So I think if you look at his work as a whole, it's not highfalutin. It's very much it's human and it's humane, and I think that's what speaks to us. We find ourselves in his work, and that's why it's like Shakespeare. You know, we find ourselves in the work.
If I was to ask you to give me your favourite bit of Burns, and I don't know whether you would or not, but I almost felt my life had been changed when I finally understood the Toast to the Haggis and went away and interpreted it for myself, looked up the dictionaries, found out what pinch, tripe and therm actually were, you know, understood what a trencher was. I didn't know what a trencher was, the groaning trencher there you fill. And the pin, what the pin was the piece of wood that would wrap up the sheep's stomach, and that pin, in theory, would be big enough to mend the mill. And I got my mind fried by the whole thing. Fried and I think opened. Do you have anything that you think that is Burns' perfection? That you love it so much you think that's a verse I'd love to take to my grave?
I'd go back to Tam O'Shanter. I mean, the love poems are wonderful, but if you really want something to get your teeth into, Tam O'Shanter is there. It sets the scene, you know, when market days are growing late and drouthy neighbours meet, and it's you picture it in your head as it unfolds, and then you've got, you know, his wife sitting at home, gathered her brows like gathering storm, nursing her wrath to keep it warm. And these are images and characters that we connect to, that speak to us. As I say, you can imagine, you know, Tam and his wife arguing about this, that, and the other thing, and he sees the lassie with the short vest on dancing away, and you know, we know from the address to the haggis that he had an appreciation of a fine pair of hurdies. So it's got all these things in it. It's got pace, it's got energy, and it's got, you know, it's got a happy ending. You know, he gets home, horses minus her tail, but he gets home in one piece. And it's an adventure. It's got suspense. First time you hear it, you don't know what's coming next. So I love the humanity of it, and I love the storytelling of it. I love a good bit of narrative poetry. You know, I like narrative is where I live. You know.
You have a different interpretation of hurdy. For me, I thought hurdy was buttock.
Your hurdies, your buttocks, yes.
To kind of round this all up, then you're hugely successful. You play in a band, you love music, you love language, you love Scotland. I know you love this country. You love whiskey, and I think when you look at modern Scotland, what do you think? Here's this country that produces the single biggest UK commodity export, which is whiskey. We have more water area, better population than any other country. I remember my dad sitting me down in the jungle going, "This is a different country, son. It's Scotland." When you look at modern Scotland, what do you think?
I think there's a lot of fine qualities about modern Scotland, but we could do better, and we should do better. We should have higher aspirations for our country. In terms of the social contract, if you like. We should be dealing with the things that make people's lives difficult. We should be dealing with child poverty. We should be dealing with drug issues. We should be dealing with the policing of the country. But I think what fundamentally we have is a society that has many good qualities. And I think that at bottom, can be very tolerant and very welcoming, but it could also be very hostile as well. And I think a lot of that comes from external forces, and personally, if I ruled the world, I would prevent anybody being anonymous on social media, because the poison that gets spread on social media, I think, is undermining so many aspects of modern life, not just in Scotland, but everywhere. So I think what we all need to bear in mind is to be maybe a little bit more kind, a little bit more generous to each other. And that's what I would like to see. But I do love my country, and I'm proud of my country, and I'm proud of what we've achieved in the last 20 odd years since we've had our own parliament. I think, broadly speaking, what the Scottish Parliament has done for us is better than what the UK Parliament has done for the UK. So, I'll stick with that. I'm not going anywhere.
Well, you're not going anywhere.
There's nowhere else I'd want to live.
Before you go, and you mentioned you liked a certain type of whiskey. Do you have a particular whiskey you like the best?
Yeah, when we had our civil partnership, we had the whiskey that we had to celebrate that was an iteration of Bowmore called Bowmore Darkest, which is you can't get anymore. I think they say now that the 15-year-old Bowmore is the nearest approximation to it. So if I could wave a magic wand and have a bottle of Bowmore Darkest, that would make me very happy. But the 15-year-old's pretty good too.
And again, if you were to recommend one whiskey to somebody starting out, let's say somebody's watching this thinking, I don't like whiskey. Maybe they have the same experience with whiskey you had with gin back in the day. And you want one whiskey to start out on, what would that be, do you think?
That's a difficult one, because you hit it wrong with that first one and you might put them off for life. So I think I would go for something reliable and smooth. It's not going to take your head off and it's not going to challenge you too much. Now, when I won the Gold Dagger for the best crime novel of the year, it was sponsored by the Macallan. And Macallan, I think, didn't exactly know what they should be doing to maintain their sponsorship. So that year that I was the Gold Dagger holder, every time I did an event at a bookshop or a library, 4 bottles of Macallan would turn up at the event. So I think that we converted quite a lot of people to whiskey over the course of that year with a wee nip of the Macallan to help the evening go with a swing. So I would go back and suggest to people that's a good beginner's whiskey.
Val McDermid, thank you. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, John. Thank you.
We're never going home. We're never going home. Can we stay with you in Scotland for the rest of our lives? We're never going home. Never going home. All it took was one sip of the water of life.